What the heck is this garbage? No, really. Who put this here? It stinks. But forget about that. You don't want to hear about that. You want to hear about Final Fantasy XVI. And I'm going to tell you what Final Fantasy XVI did. Video games are dead, and we've killed them. And Final Fantasy XVI is just further proof of it. Now, before you say anything, I know what you're thinking. You're going to go ahead and be like, what are you, stupid? Video games are doing great. They're more popular than ever. Go walk in a ditch. Right? You're going to tell me to do that. But you know what? I'm going to tell you don't understand. You probably haven't played video games in a very long time. And what you're actually playing is something completely different. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, why don't we go ahead and sit down and have a nice conversation. Maybe hold hands over a cup of tea and sing happy songs together if we're lucky. Or maybe that's just really weird and you just want to hear me talk, which is completely understandable too. First, I would like to go ahead and show you the dictionary. Yeah, it's been a long time since you've seen one of these, huh? Specifically, we're going to be looking at the Merriam-Webster dictionary because that's just the easiest for me to get my hands on. Let's look at the word video game. It's a noun, by the way. You know what a noun is? It's a person, place, or thing. It's a noun. Video game. Its definition is a game played with images on a video screen. Now, I don't know about you, but that's pretty straightforward. Makes a lot of sense, right? But why don't we dive a little deeper? Let's look at the word video, which is also a noun. Let's look at definition 2 of the word video. Being, relating to, or involving images on a television screen or computer display. Yeah, that sounds like that's in relationship to what video games are, right? Now let's look at the definition for the word game, which is also a noun. Definition 2a. Activity engaged in for diversion or amusement, in relationship to the word play. Now yeah, that makes perfect sense to me too. You put those two words together, you get a good idea of what the definition of video game is, right? Makes a lot of sense if you ask me. So, what does this got to do with Final Fantasy XVI, right? Well, the demo, if you're unaware, is basically, you know, the beginning segment of the game, so like about the first few hours, right? So if you start off the demo, it's basically starting off the beginning of the game. Alright, you with me? So, when I played that beginning segment of the game, I couldn't help but notice that I felt like I barely played anything. And I'm not joking, I literally felt like I barely played anything. So I got curious, and I actually decided to record how much gameplay there was within the first hour of Final Fantasy XVI. And I'm not even joking, it was a grand total of 15 minutes and 30 seconds. And the hour ended right in the middle of the first boss fight. Like the very beginning of it. And I want to, clarify, I wasn't skipping through gameplay. I was taking my time. I was running around looking for any sort of hidden items or secrets or whatever. Because that's how I like playing games. I like taking my time. And it was on, the normal difficulty. I didn't have any of that easy junk on. But out of an hour, 15 minutes and 30 seconds of gameplay, I feel like the first hour of a game is what really establishes, how you're going to view the game and, if it's going to really drag you in. And the majority of it was cutscenes. It's like I'm sitting down watching a movie. It's a very cinematic experience. So cinematic to the point that even in the combat of this game, they have a cinema strike and a cinema evade, right? So cinematic strike, cinematic evade, and a whole bunch of cutscenes play associated with that. You're literally in the middle of the gameplay, in the middle of the moment, and then I'll just cut you out of it and throw a cutscene at you. And then you sit there and you press a button, and then more stuff happens on the screen. It's like it takes the fun and the action away, as if to say, no, what we're showing you on the screen is more fun and amazing than the actual gameplay. And it feels so weird. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I was really curious if there were any other very cinematic-based games, right? Like Final Fantasy XVI. And there were several I could think of off the top of my head, and I wanted to see how much gameplay you got with them in the first hour. So first, I have God of War Ragnarok here, and for that game, I had 31 minutes and 23 seconds of gameplay in the first hour, and funnily enough, I also ended during the first real big boss fight. You had like a tutorial boss before that, but then you had like the first real big boss fight, and the first hour was like in the middle of that. Then I had Final Fantasy VII Remake. So, you know, I figured comparing it to another Final Fantasy game, that makes sense, right? And that one's pretty story heavy and action oriented, you know, just like 16. And I had 32 minutes and 15 seconds of gameplay, and my hour session ended a little, like several minutes after the first boss fight, because the first boss fight was like a little bit earlier. So okay, you know, so alright, so, and again, another boss done in the first hour, right? Then I picked Devil May Cry 5 Special Edition, right? Because, you know, the guy that worked on, you know, combat for Devil May Cry, right, is also working on Final Fantasy XVI's combat, and to be quite honest, the combat is pretty much the same thing. Let's say what it is, it's pretty much the same thing. I had 31 minutes and 30 seconds of gameplay in the first hour, because there's a lot of cutscenes in that game too, and my hour session actually ended during a cutscene that started immediately after the first boss fight. So I finished the boss, and a cutscene was going on. Then, for final good measure, I have Nier Replicant, the remake of the older game, and I had 36 minutes of gameplay and 37 seconds, and that ended while I was in the middle of a cutscene that was going to happen before the first boss fight. Now, the only reason why that gameplay number is a little bit higher for Nier Replicant is because the game is actually organized a little bit differently, because maybe that game is a little less linear than the others, if that makes any sense. The point is, I took my time with all the gameplay, and if you notice, in the first hour for all these games about, you're at a boss fight, and that seems to be the norm, right? You're having a boss fight, but you're also having a huge mix of other cutscenes. But for Final Fantasy XVI, they give you the least amount of time to play the game within the first hour. Now remember all those definitions I gave before. I'm going to look at a few more words here, and you'll probably start piecing together exactly what I'm implying here. Let's look at the definition of the word movie. It's a noun. Definition 1. A recording of moving images that tells a story that people watch on a screen or television in relationship to the phrase motion picture, otherwise known as cinema. Now, speaking of cinema, I mentioned how Final Fantasy XVI has like cinematic evade, cinematic strike, right? Let's look at the word cinematic. It's an adjective. Let's look at definition 2. Filmed and presented as a motion picture, alright? So, all these games I listed earlier have a lot of cinematic elements to them. And let's think about that for a second. So, they say Final Fantasy XVI is going to have 11 hours of cinematic cutscenes. Cutscenes that are presented as if they were a movie. All the other games I listed have cutscenes that are like that too. But cinematic cutscenes are not the only kind of cutscenes, I should clarify. A game like Nier Replicant, for example, it has a lot of cutscenes because it's very dialogue heavy, but it's a little bit different than that. You also have characters talking to each other through text boxes, and all of the text is fully voice acted. So in a way, that dialogue sequence is a cutscene, but it's not cinematic, if that makes any sense, right? It's a bit of an interesting take to see how a game should be if it's telling a story. And there's even the question if a game should have a story to begin with at all. Most modern games, they have a setting and a story to help define the game world, and it's supposed to be a supplement to the gameplay. It gives you a motivation for gameplay, right? Or there's just a fun mechanic in the gameplay that keeps you motivated for playing it, or you want to explore the world, or whatever, right? But lately, more and more games are putting this emphasis on the story, and that the motivation for playing it is to finish up a story. And they take that a step further, and they make it that the gameplay is a supplement to the story. Gameplay is taking a back seat while you want to sit down and watch the movie and occasionally play, because instead of playing a game, you are playing a movie. What I feel like is happening is that you're not playing a video game, you're playing a cinematic game, or should we call them cinema games? Some of you might say, well, what's the problem with that? What's the big deal with that? You'll say, well, you know what, that's just the beginning of the game. And if you did the Elkin trial of the demo for Final Fantasy XVI, you'll see there's more gameplay. And yeah, I know that's true. I timed that too, actually. It took me a total of 47 minutes and 36 seconds to finish the whole thing. And out of that, 33 minutes and 2 seconds was gameplay. And yeah, I was happy to see that. I had an alright time playing that. It was fun. Don't get me wrong, I'm all excited for the game too. And I had fun playing the demo. But sprinkled in that gameplay during some of those climactic moments that feel good to control, they literally take it away to give you glorified QuickTime events. And it just feels like that the boss is just taking damage without you really doing anything. It's almost insulting to me. Just how that feels when I play it. Because again, it's like you're in the middle of gameplay and then boom, up, here's a cutscene. Wow, watch the cutscene. See, you're so busy watching the cutscene. Now look, there's a timer and you gotta press the button. And oh look, you get free damage. Or oh look, the boss is staggered. And now you can go ahead and inflict more damage for free. It's like the game is having pity on you. Or the focus is that you should just sit down and watch it. Just watch the experience. And yes, playing it is such a big inconvenience. So let's make it that you can watch more of it while you're playing. You see, boss fights were supposed to be the big test. And I don't understand why I'm starting to see in more and more games that regular old enemies feel more satisfying to fight, like harder enemies, than some of these bosses. And that's my initial impression from Final Fantasy XVI. There are more and more people that want these cinematic games. That's what they're looking forward to. They want to get invested in the story. In fact, there's so many people like that I know people that say they won't play a game unless it has a good story. Imagine hearing that sentence. I won't play it unless it has a good story. Why do you play a video game? You're playing it because you want to play a game, right? Think of it this way. Why do people play chess? People play chess because they like playing chess. They're not playing it because they like watching a cutscene of the pieces interact with each other in between every time they move the pieces. It's not going to matter what the pieces look like. The pieces could literally be little styrofoam circles with a symbol on them to represent what piece it's supposed to be. People would gladly play chess that way too. It's about playing chess, not watching it, you know, and then occasionally getting to play. And that's what video games were too. Old retro games, you know. I understand it was probably because of hardware limitations, but most of them back in the day, if you wanted a story, it was pretty much in the manual. And even for the ones that were a little bit more story focused, like let's say, I don't know, Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy from the old days, right? There weren't really that many cutscenes per se. You were reading dialogue boxes, and you had to take in the information, use that information to search the game world for secrets, and to figure out what your next objective was. That was the beauty of it. It was your own adventure that you had full control over. You made the effort to get the information, you made the effort to explore, and you got rewarded for it. But now, people don't want to make that effort, and they want to sit back and enjoy a movie. And the reason why I think that is because games have begotten so popular, they have reached an audience they were never intended for. And money talks, and that's why that's now the mainstream. So yeah, cinema games are going to be very successful moving forward, and don't get me wrong, I can enjoy a good cinema game or two. I just listed a bunch of them earlier. You think I haven't played and beaten those before? Nier Replicant's one of my personal favorites. But why is it one of my personal favorites, right? Well, I had to think about it a little bit, and I think it has something to do with those dialogue cutscenes I mentioned earlier. So like, those text boxes, right? I know most people don't like reading. I must be one of the few that do. But like, you pay attention to that, even if you're just there listening to the dialogue and not reading it, you still have to push a button, right? So I'm going to ask you something. What's more interactive, sitting and watching or reading? There's more activity going on in your brain processing the words, and then pressing a button to continue the conversation. It isn't much, and I don't think that's a good way to point at it and say gameplay, but it's kinda like gameplay, because there's something you're responding to. That's very interactive. You're paying attention to the dialogue and pressing a button to continue it. But you can do it at your own pace. A QuickTime event, you're not really focusing on much. There's nothing to process. You're just watching a bunch of stuff moving around, and then a button shows up on the screen with a little timer, and you have to press it before it runs out, and then you get to do that again. And then you have to keep doing that until you get access to play the game again. There's nothing for you to really process in your mind. Again, all of this has me concerned about the future of video games and the rise of the cinema game. How will games look 20 years from now? How will they look 10 years from now? How will they look 5 years from now? But what do you think? How do you feel about the rise of cinema games? How do you feel about the lack of video games? If you thought this was an interesting discussion, maybe subscribe. Or you could yell at me and tell me how stupid I am. Both work. But for real, take care.